and ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
I would like to start with a quote of Paulo Coelho on the decision making. It is a good idea always to do something relaxing prior to making an important decision in our life. To sustain the RRC code, Swachh Tan, Swachh Man and Swachh Bharat, I would like to share my thoughts on the Swachh Man. Friends, it is a common knowledge that we can give only what we have. Yet many of us forget that we cannot remain in service mode unless we sometimes help ourselves. I would like to urge all of you to take some time for yourself and think how to improve our soul. Our soul is what defines our personality, the way we act, and how we will feel among other things. Enriching and improving our soul can make our life more fulfilling. If we want to work on the improving our soul, following tips may be considered on the day-to-day basis. First is, focus on the things that really matter to us, like our family, friends, beliefs, and anything we do that would make life worth living. Second is pray. Pray for peace in our life, for things you need, for others, and also to thank. Forgive. Learning how to let go the things people have done wrong to you. Be kind to others. Be nice for one and all. Friends, co-workers, and competent strangers. For example, hold a door open for a stranger, take a friend out for a coffee, or give a family member a phone call to tell them you love them and care them. Surrounding yourself with beauty. Music, literature, and art, all we have unique way of improving our soul by opening us up to new experience and feelings. In my view, our RRC committee has designed this 30th RRC to fulfill all three things: music, literature, and art for the delegates present here. Let go of worry. Letting go of the worry and thoughts that preoccupy our mind. Think logically and tell yourself you should not worry about anything beyond your control. So friends, today onwards, let us commit ourselves that there will be no complaint from our life and we will be happy and calm in every situation in journey of our life. With this, I request Chetan to take over the charge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Avinash. Jai Jagannath.
Jai Jagannath.
Respected Vice President Shri Avinash Talwani, Joint Secretary Shri Hinesh Bhai Doshi, dignitaries on and off the dais, and my dear friends. Let me begin with a shlok surrendering to the Lord and seeking His blessings. कायेन वाचा मनसेंद्रिये वा बुधात्मना वा प्रकृति स्वभावा करोमि यत् सकल परस्मै नारायणायति समर्पयामि. It means whatever I do with the body, speech, mind or sense organs, either by discrimination of the intellect or by the deeper feelings of the heart or by the existing tendencies of the mind, I do them all without ownership and I surrender them to the Supreme Lord. In Gita Sar, Lord Krishna says, the only way to achieve lifelong happiness is to surrender to Him. Why do you worry unnecessarily? What are you afraid of? whatever happened in past happened for the best. Whatever is happening in the present is happening for the best. And whatever will happen in future will happen for the best. Don't repent on past. Don't worry for future. Concentrate on your present. Offer yourself to the Almighty Lord. This is the best support. One who knows this unconditional support gains freedom from fear, worry and desire. Let us wholeheartedly surrender to Lord Jagannath in this pious land of Puri and seek his blessings for the well-being of one and all. And may there be positive vibes circulating amongst us during our whole stay in this place in Puri. Friends, I am sure that since the time we have reached this resort, each one of us have come close to each other and knitted in one big family, where the bond of friendship have become more stronger. It is this charm of our residential refresher course that one is always eager to attend it to add more and more friends into one's fold. This moment was very truly reflected during all our events of yesterday, and that's why I am tempted to say to all my dear friends that राही बदल जाते हैं पर रास्ते नहीं बदलते, तूफान आए फिर भी मौसम नहीं बदलते, गिले शिकवे भले हो कितने मगर आप जैसे दोस्त कभी नहीं बदलते. And continuing with this good feeling of real friendship, let us start with our today's technical session on the subject of deeming fictions in the Income Tax Act 1961. To present this paper, we have amongst us an experienced and able practicing chartered accountant, a past president of the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society, a current editor of the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society's journal, a multifaceted personality, contributing articles in various journals, magazines and newspapers, presented papers at both the residential as well as non-residential refresher courses of the professional bodies, delivered lectures at various places in the country for the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society and the Chamber of Tax Consultants, a guest faculty for the Income Tax Department at the Nagpur Academy of the Direct Tax Nagpur and Regional Training Center, Mumbai, and he is on the panel of the Charitable Trust Clinic conducted by the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society. Ladies and gentlemen, proudly presenting before you our today's paper writer, Shri Anil Sateji. Anilji, we welcome you to this RRC and would like to say, फूलों की हर कली खुशबू मांगे आपसे, फूलों की हर कली खुशबू मांगे आपसे, जिंदगी की हर मुस्कान खुशी मांगे आपसे, इतनी रोशनी हो आपके जीवन में कि खुद टाटा वाले पावर मांगे आपसे. Before I request Sri Anil Sateji to present his paper, I would request our Vice President Sri Avinash Lalwani ji to present a memento to Sri C.A. Anil Sateji as a mark of our love and respect. Anilji, the floor is yours. Vice President Avinash Lalwani, Chetan, Dinesh, and my dear friends, let me at the outset Langley Chamber, and I just went back in time. I was here to write a paper for the Chamber sometime in 2003. Close to 12 years, after which I'm back here again. It's been a very enjoyable experience for two reasons. The first, I have already placed in my paper, that the topic that I was allotted was a topic I dealt with around 5 years ago at the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society. So it lessened my burden to some extent. But as I wrote the paper, I realized that though in life questions remain the same, the answers keep changing. So what I answered 2008 or 9 no longer holds good, and what I will speak today may not hold later. As far as the subject proper is concerned, it's a difficult subject. I'm told by my fellow participants that yesterday evening you had a very enjoyable experience, an erudite speaker speaking on a difficult topic. I'm not the expert speaker, but then I will try to take you through this topic for the next 70 to 75 minutes. Deeming fictions. We deal with fictions every day in life. And we believe that what has been stated is what is believed. When all of us explain to our wives as to why we were delayed in office, the lady smiles. We believe that she has believed us. That's a fiction of her. She never believes. She really knows, what it really takes. And when I wrote this paper, as I said, every time I looked at various provisions of law, I felt myself a novice. And I was remembering the words of my daughter. She was very young then. And she asked her mother, what does Papa do? So she said that he's a practicing child. My daughter was in the first standard. She said, Papa, you still practice. That's how I still am. I still practice. Fictions, deeming fictions in law are required to ensure that the loopholes which we all, through our creative minds, seek to create are attempted to be plugged to some extent by the lawmakers. When I was hearing the group discussions, and I'll spend a couple of minutes on that, the constant refrain was in regard to various situations which were placed before you for discussion. And quite interesting discussion took place in all the groups. What I really wanted to point out was that when you look at deeming fictions, look at first principles, look at the purpose for which that fiction came into the law, whether that purpose is achieved by the plain literal meaning. If not, then whether any other meaning can be given to those plain words to make that workable. If one looks at the literal meaning of each and every word that appears in the statute, then possibly the purpose for which those fictions were created may not really come to the fore. So, during my entire presentation, this is one strain of thought which will run all through. And what I therefore propose to do is to go straight into the various poses raised at various points of time. I will refer to the relevant paragraph in which those posers are there, and in the context of those posers, and as I put before you my thoughts and my answers, I will also take you through what the concepts of gaming fictions would be. The first poser that I have raised is in paragraph 2b in regard to the return being filed electronically under section 139. Earlier, we all had a position where when a return was due in a prescribed form with the prescribed particulars and had to be filed, verifying it in the prescribed manner, we all comfortably filed a paper return. In this age of electronic media, now in certain situations you file the return electronically with your digital signature, your task ends there. In some stages you file your return electronically without your digital signature, and thereafter you are required to furnish ITR file within a period of 120 days to the central processing unit in Bangalore. The issue that I had raised was that what would really happen when that particular acknowledgement which you have to furnish within a period of 120 days does not reach Bangalore. Let me point out that section 139 in itself does not prescribe any manner in which the return is furnished. That is then prescribed by Rule 12, and the central processing scheme in a particular clause puts forth the fact that if your ITR 5 does not reach Bangalore within the specified period of 120 days, then your return is treated as never having been filed. In that situation, if you do actually send that ITR 5, but it does not reach Bangalore within 120 days, what would be the consequences and what are the arguments or remedies available? One view of the matter is that, of course, once you have done what your part is, nothing further needs to be done. I do not look at it this way. The reason being that the furnishing of that ITR 5 is not, to my mind, an idle formality, because a return of income has to be furnished in a prescribed form. It has to contain prescribed particulars, but it has to be verified in the prescribed manner. The verification at the end of the form or the declaration that your belief that the return is a true and correct return is not an idle formality. It is on the basis of that verification that your return is identified with you, with your discharge of your obligation to file return. So to my mind, it's imperative that at some stage the ITR 5 duly signed by you does reach the Income Tax Department's offices to make your return a valid return, because on the basis of that return would the further processing lie. And if it does not reach, then there would be severe consequences. So I would take a view that though once you have put into the speed post, once, maybe twice, the ITR 5, you have done your bit, but your return will be treated as having been furnished only when that particular ITR 5 reaches that office, or it is only at that point of time that the return will be complete. Yes, you must be required or you must be given enough ample opportunity to ensure completion or compliance with that formality, but without that, I don't think that your return would be complete. Once that formality is completed, then the furnishing of the return would relate back to the date on which you put it into the electronic form, And on that date, and with reference to that date, all consequences of carry forward of losses, the 143 notice, etc. will flow. I would refer to circular number 4 of 2014, dated 10 February 2014, as well as a decision of the Bombay High Court in 204 Taxman 598. So that is as far as the first poser goes. As far as the second poser, it's not a poser as such, but I was only bringing it out in para 2D of my paper in regard to the explanation to section 6 of the Hindu Succession Act. Explanation 6 now treats a female who has married at any point of time to be a co-parsoner of the family, despite the fact that according to classical Hindu law, post-marriage she may have joined the family of her husband. I am all for women empowerment, but I think that when one does violence to a statute like the Hindu Succession Act, which is an attempt to codify the classical Hindu law, a little more care possibly at the consequences should have been taken. Look at the consequences of treating that female member as a co-parson. Now what happens is that because at any point of time after the Amendment Act of 2005 she is treated as a co-parsoner, she becomes a co-parsoner in the family in which she was born. She becomes a member of the family in which she marries into. And we came across a grave situation where that in an unfortunate event that she goes into the second family, has a daughter who thereafter marries into family 3, then the young girl would be through her marriage a member of the family that she marries into, claiming through her mother a member of her father's family, and also can create an interest into her grandfather's family. Something which possibly was not intended by the lawmakers, but these are the consequences that could flow. We don't have time to get into that because that would be then presentation of the Hindu Succession Act. But I just thought that when you look at amendments and create fictions, look at consequences because they may at some point of time be reasonably severe. With that, let me go to the specific posers which the former president of the chamber had asked me to look at. And the first section which I will deal with is section 23. Section 23, which fictionally deems annual value in respect of properties which have not been let out as income of an assessee, is one of the very few sections which brings to charge notional income which has never been received by the assessee. Section 56 we will look at. I am not deliberately looking at 50C as of now. 50C is a part of a chapter on capital gains. Capital gains in itself is a fiction. So therefore 50C, 43CA inherently deal with a fictional income. But the only other provision prior to, of course, 56, where you look at deemed income or fictional income, was section 23. In terms of section 23, what happens is that you will bring to tax in the respect of property which has not been let out and is lying vacant, a notional income, the quantum being the amount of rent for which the property could have been reasonably let. That is the mandate of section 23(1). And in that context, I had raised a few posers. I'll serially deal with each one of them. What normally happens in a situation where a property is not let is that one looks at either standard rent or one looks at municipal rateable value. And I have asked the question is that in determining a sum for property which might be reasonably let, does the assessing officer have to consider standard rent in respect of properties by rent control legislation or the municipal rate? I have covered the first 2-3 poses at one go. I would look at section 23, 1A and 1B in this manner. That the mandate of section 23, 1A is that you have to look at the fair rental, which the indicator thereof would be the municipal valuation, and that has been accepted by a plethora of judgments, including the recent Bombay High Court judgment in 160 TTR, tip-top for typography. So therefore, if one is to look at 23(1)A simpliciter, then the municipal rateable value would be a fair indicator of the rent for which the property may be let. I am conscious of the fact that in a city like Mumbai now you don't have the old proposition of the annual rateable value. You have a percentage of the capital value. You are now shifting to the capital value. But even then, section 154 of the Municipal Corporation Act has not been given a go by. 154 still talks of determination of or charging property taxes with reference to the rent which the property may receive, and for that an indicator would be the capitalized value or a percentage. There are told they'll take something like 0.4% or something of that sort. So that would be the first indicator. In a situation where the property is let, of course one would look at 23(1)B, which says that in a situation where the rent is higher, you would take that rent. In a situation where that rent is lower than the municipal rateable value, you would take the municipal rateable value. At what stage can the assessing officer embark upon an examination to find out the rent other than the municipal rateable value? And the Bombay High Court clearly gives a path to be taken. What they say is that if you have municipal rateable value, you adopt that. If there is no municipal rateable value and there is an indicator of fair rent, you adopt that. If the property has been let, then 23(1)B will come into play. You go by the mandate of 23(1)B. In a situation that the AO believes, because 23(1)B is actual rent received, and only in a situation where the AO is able to point out that there are circumstances to establish that the transaction between the lessor and the lessee, or the licensor and the licensee, is not a genuine transaction but is influenced by either fraud, error, misrepresentation. Only in that stage can you seek to disregard 23(1)B, go back to 23(1)A and look at the fair valuation. So ordinarily, either the rent received or in situations where the municipal rateable value is available and is higher than the rent received, the municipal rateable value, if the AO either believes that one, the transaction is not a genuine transaction and is influenced by various other factors, in that case he can embark on an inquiry, and the result of that inquiry he must put forth to an assessee to rebut and determine the fair rental. If he believes that the municipal rateable value or the value determined by the local authority does not indicate the fair rental, then also the onus is passed upon him to record the circumstances in which that can be done, and in such a situation also he can embark on an inquiry to find out the fair rental. So once the onus is discharged by an assessee of either putting forth before the assessing officer the documentation in regard to rental in terms of an agreement, etc., or if property is not lent, the principal rental value or the value determined by a local authority in terms of the basis of taxation of property. If either of these bases are to be disregarded, the onus then shifts to an assessing officer to find out what that fair rental is. In finding out that fair rental, notional interest on deposit cannot be included. However, if deposit is so large so as to influence the fair rental, that aspect can be considered, but notional rent cannot be treated as a part of fair rental. I think this is the manner in which one will have to proceed, looking at 23(1)(a) and 23(1)(b). You have to look at them serially, decide which clause applies, and how either of the actual rent received or the principal rental value can be ignored. I have also pointed out in terms of deposit that notional interest cannot be included. If that deposit is heavy and the deposit is paid not to the lessor or the owner of property but some other person, even then the notional interest cannot be included, but payment of that deposit to some other party may indicate an intent on part of the parties not to disclose the true parameters of the transaction, and to that extent the AO may be able to consider the factor of either a huge deposit being received by the lessor himself or by his associate entity or associate company, as the case may be. The next question that I had raised was in regard to two properties or two residential houses which are both actually self-occupied and actually used by the assessee as his own residence. The thought that was passing through my mind was this, is that in section 23 the word used is a residential house. 23(4) limits the application of that term if you have more than one residential houses to only one of those. The thought that I wanted to place before you is that we have urged, prior of course to the amendment of 2014, that either adjacent houses having one common kitchen, etc., or in other places, or in the sense other courts have gone to an extent that that word per house should be read as plural. We have more than one house. Now, in regard to two adjacent houses used by the assessee as one for the purpose of residence, in regard to the claim under section 54, we have treated them as falling within the definition of even a single residential house for the purposes of a claim under section 54. Now, if one argues that proposition, what impact it would have on section 23 is what I wanted you to consider. The situation that I therefore put was that yes, you have two residential houses, both with borrowed money. Ordinarily, of course, the limitation qua the interest allowability under section 24 would apply only to one residential house, but if you have urged that they are only, it is only one residential house in a claim under section 54, whether that would come into your way for the purposes of a claim under section 24, I think that would not happen because section 23 operates in a different field, and even though for the purposes of an exemption under section 54 you have made that claim, still for the limited purpose of annual value, one house would be nil and the other house would nil sub, and if there is a borrowing, the limitation of section 24 provides would apply. To the other which is deemed let out, of course, it would not apply. Section 54, our thought process in section 54, our claim in section 54 would not come in our way. The last in clause F, which I have said, I pointed out only for the limited purpose of bringing to the fore the fact that the fiction in one act cannot apply to another. So even if for the purposes of the Income Tax Act a house is deemed to be let out, that fiction cannot help you in the Wealth Tax Act. And though in clause 2EA, if a residential house has been let out, it is not an asset for the purposes of Wealth Tax Act. This particular deeming fiction of the house being deemed let out would not help you as far as the Wealth Tax Act is concerned. With that, let me go to clause B and section 44AD. The amendment to section 44AD, making it applicable for all SSEs, or rather all businesses, excluding from its ambit a very few, is a classic case of a well-meaning provision having really gone out. Earlier, as I said, 44AD applied only to construction businesses and some other businesses, certain other limited category of businesses. Now it applies all across the board, and therefore these problems have been created. I have taken a case where there is a situation of a trader in securities having a turnover of 60 lakhs, earning a profit of 2,50,000, and after the set-off of negative interest of 1 lakh, his income is below the limit chargeable to tax under the Income Tax Act. In that situation, now will the mandate of 44AD1 hit him, and will he have to pay tax at 8% of the turnover of rupees 60 lakhs is what I wanted to bring up. Because 44AD5 permits one to make a claim of income lower than 8%, but section 44AD applies only in a situation where, notwithstanding anything contained in the foregoing paragraphs of this section, an eligible assessee who claims that his profits and gains of the eligible business are lower than the profits and gains specified in subsection 1, and whose total income exceeds the maximum amount which is not chargeable to income tax, will be required to maintain books and other documents as required under 44AA and get them audited. So the obligation of an assessee who claims a lower income is to maintain books and to carry out an audit is contained in 44AD5. The conditions are cumulative, so the benefit, if I may use that term, of 44AD5 will not be available to Mr. A because his income is below the limit chargeable to tax. Now, in such a situation, what would be the remedy available? I would take a view that 44AD5 casts only an obligation on a person who seeks to claim that his income is less than 8%. The obligation cast is to maintain accounts and to get those accounts audited. That does not mean that a person who believes that his income is less than the prescribed 8% cannot file a return of lower income. Yes, the obligation to establish that income being lower than 8% on him may be far heavier but that does not mean that he is out and has to pay tax on 8%. And that is why I say when you look at a fiction, you have to look at it for the purpose for which it was created. You have to look to Hayden's rule. Section 4485, presumptive taxation, was brought on the statute book for facilitating the ease or facilitating small assessees not to maintain books of account and submit their income on a presumptive basis. The law permitted that presumption to be rebutted by casting some further obligations on that assessee of maintenance of books and filing an audited accounts. That by itself, to my mind, would not throw an assessee out of the window who is otherwise able to establish that his income from business is lower than 8%. And I think it is very much possible for Mr. A to maintain books of account, file them before the assessing officer and contend that his income is less than what is prescribed by 4480. And I do not think that merely because he does not fall within the parameters of 4480, 4485, he would have no remedy whatsoever, because you cannot bring to tax income which is not income of an assessee. A presumption under 4480 must always be a rebuttable presumption. An absolute presumption would never stand, in my opinion, the test of judicial scrutiny. So therefore, in my view, it's possible for Mr. A to file such a return. Then with the 2 or 3 examples which I gave here, only to illustrate as to what happens when one deletes a particular provision. There, the first case that I have brought out is that in regard to the assessee, individual or firm, 90 lakhs turnover, 7 lakhs profits, whether 44A and 44AB would apply. Obviously they would apply because the turnover is more than the prescription of 44A, and because the percentage of profit is less than 8%, he would have to conduct an audit under 44A. As far as the second proposition is concerned, the answer given, the conclusion drawn at that stage or by the particular person is that individual 90 lakhs, 5 lakhs loss, and at that stage 44A and 44AB do not apply. Yes, undoubtedly here the claim is less than 8%. 4485 does not come into play because the total income is less than the what is liable to tax, but you are not excluded from the requirement to maintain accounts because 44AA still operates in your case, and you would therefore be required to maintain books of account, and having maintained those books of account, furnish them to an assessing officer. So though 44AB may not apply because 4485 obligation does not apply to you, 44A, to my mind, would still apply. As far as the third proposition is concerned, here 44AA will apply and 44AB, the same situation as in the first situation. You will have to maintain books of account on account of the turnover, but because the total income is less than what is chargeable to tax, the obligation under 4485 would not apply to you. 44A would apply. One of the groups expressed a view that in case of losses, automatically the mandate of 4481 would not apply to such a person. I would not concur with that proposition. And one other view was expressed that when you look at the illustration that I have given, 5 lakhs and brought forward business loss of 10 lakhs, the thinking was that brought forward business loss has not to be considered because you are considering 4480 which falls within the business chapter. I do not concur with that. I would take a view that the words total income as used in 4480 would be the total income as is understood in the Income Tax Act otherwise, and would therefore be after set off of losses, the entire computation machinery would have to be gone through. Then clause 3, those are at 3A and B. Here a person has two separate and distinct businesses. The turnover in each business is less than 1 crore, but more than 1 crore in the aggregate. Net profit is higher than 8%. Can he claim 4480 for more? Yes, 4480 is qua business. So one assessee carrying on two different businesses, each having a limit of less than 1 crore. To my mind, 4480 will be available to that person for both businesses. Would he be liable to tax audit? Yes, the answer to that question is yes, he would be liable for tax audit. The reason being that the earlier provision which excluded the turnover of presumptive taxation from the limits of 44AB is no longer on the statute book from assessment year 11-12. So therefore, such an assessee, if his aggregate turnover of both his businesses put together, both of them qualifying for 4480, would still have to carry out a tax audit. I am conscious that the institute in its guidance note at para 5.21 holds a different view. With utmost humility and respect, I do not concur with that proposition, because that was on the basis of the mandate of 4485 as it then stood prior to assessment 11-12, that no longer survives on the statute. So to my mind, once the aggregate turnover of that particular person crosses the limits mentioned in 44AB, he would have to conduct a tax audit. Similarly, the same answer would come for the next proposition. Again, two distinct businesses, 1 crore and having net profits of more than 8%, return or other businesses more than 1 crore. Can he claim benefits of 4480 to the first? The answer is obviously yes. Whether you would be required to conduct audit of both businesses? Yes, he would be required to conduct audit of both businesses, but it is possible for the auditee to appoint two separate auditors for two separate businesses. But yes, the mandate of 44AB would have to be complied in regard to both. It is possible for both businesses to be conducted by two different auditors. With that, let me get into the provision which, shall we say, discussed, or there was great discussion and which generated the most heat. Section 50C. Before I go to section 50C issues that I have raised simpliciter in the various paragraphs, the issues begin with para 1.6. Let me give an overview and my thought process on 50C, because that thought process will permeate through my all answers and most of them will be clear to you. We had the classical decision of KP Varghese, where the Supreme Court held that unless the assessing officer brings forth evidence to establish that consideration other than what has been stated in the agreement or document is received by an assessee, it cannot be brought to tax on a notional basis. That full value of consideration stated in the agreement cannot be otherwise substituted. It was virtually impossible for the revenue to bring forth that evidence given the manner in which real estate transactions are conducted. In order to overcome the decision or the problems that the revenue faced in bringing to tax alleged or presumed understatement of consideration, 50C came on the statute book. And therefore, 50C came on the statute book for a specific purpose, to resolve a particular gap in the law. So therefore, we must consider the law as it stood earlier, the purpose for which 50C was introduced, what 50C actually provides, and what is the true ambit thereof. A classic case of Hayden's rules. let us would apply here. And if one considers this provision in the perspective that I have just put before you, then a lot of issues will be clear. The trigger to section 50C is that consideration received accruing or arising as a result of transfer by an assessee of a capital asset being land or building or both. So we have to test two propositions. One, or two main propositions. One, whether there is a transfer, capital asset, whether consideration accrues and arises, and whether we are dealing with land or building or both. It is sought to be urged that in case of a development agreement, the last limb of it being a transfer of land and building does not apply, and therefore the development agreement, as is commonly understood and commonly executed in all metros across the country, for that matter all across the country, into such development agreements 50C will not apply. Let's assume for a moment that this is the correct interpretation of law, and let us look at the consequences. Now, if one assumes that this is, you have to interpret 50C literally, and because a development agreement only permits a developer to develop the property with the legal ownership of the property continuing to vest with the landlord or the owner, it is not transfer of land or building, and because it is not transfer of land and building, 50C does not apply. If that is the case, then in such a situation, what would happen is that to a development agreement, 50C will not apply because it is not transfer of land and building, and to the subsequent conveyance of property which takes place, what is the normal parameter of a standard development agreement? That a landlord permits or an owner permits a developer to develop or utilize the development potential of his property, construct, reconstruct, redevelop the property, sell it to outsiders, and then either to an organization called a condominium or a cooperative society, the entire land and building is then sought to be transferred. If a development agreement does not fall within the parameters of section 50C on account of there being no transfer of land and building as is understood in the classical sense, then at the stage at which the land is conveyed also it would not apply, because at that stage there is no consideration accruing or arising to the transfer of, because the transaction qua the capital gain chapter under 247 has already taken place, income has already been brought to tax, no consideration at the stage of conveyance normally accrues or arises to the landlord at all. So therefore, at both stages you would be outside the mandate of section 50C. Can such an interpretation hold the field? To my mind, it cannot. It cannot hold the field, because then the purpose of bringing 50C on the statute book would stand totally defeated, and an interpretation which suppresses the mischief and advances the remedy is something which is normally to be adopted in statutory interpretation. And if that be the case, according to me, a development agreement where significant dominion and control of the land is transferred or foregone from a landlord or owner to the transferee developer, at that stage, to my mind, 50C will apply for the reasons that I have put forth. There could be other supports to the argument also, that land and building in itself is not defined in the Income Tax Act. What has been defined is immovable property in the context of the acquisition chapter. And it is often sought to be urged that because In the acquisition chapter, they use the term immovable property. In that, they included the term rights in regard to land and building. Since those same phraseologies do not appear in section 50C, it is only land and building which would be covered, and rights in regard to immovable property or rights in regard to land and building would not be covered. As I said, I do not concur with the proposition because of the reasons that I just put forth, that a deeming fiction has to be given in certain areas. Yes, there are limitations with which it has to be interpreted, but a purposive interpretation must necessarily have to be given, and to that extent, I would take a view that to development agreements, definitely section 50C would apply. Having said that, let me come to the next 2 or 3 issues which I have raised in para 1.6 as to what would be the proposition in case of joint development agreements. Development agreements, as are normally drafted, are nothing more but agreements of sale. The entire dominion and control, at times even the power to give the final conveyance is transferred by the landlord to the developer. What he retains is a semblance of legal title and nothing more. So to that extent, to my mind, for reasons which I have just explained, 50C would apply at that stage, and you would have to consider the rigors of section 50C. In a joint development agreement, of course, there could be a variation. Joint development agreements, I would look at, this is not the place to discuss development agreements, etc. But in joint development agreement, what often happens is that the landowner becomes a co-venturer along with the developer. In that situation, he often shares risk and reward to some extent by enjoying a fair amount of the constructed area. At times, he shares revenue. At times, he shares variation of volume. Suppose he says 50% of constructed area, 50 flats, 60 flats. In that situation, he would probably become a co-venturer. If that happens, then one would have to look at the proposition of section 45(2) coming into play. 45(2) would operate. At that stage, the capital gains in the hands of the landlord would stand fructified, because there also at the stage of the conversion of the capital asset into stock in trade, there is a concept of fair market value. The stamp duty valuation that at that stage would be a fair indicator of that fair market value. At that stage, possibly the capital gains would stand crystallized, and thereafter the surpluses that flow out of the transactions that succeed would probably be treated as business income. That is what I would look at joint development agreements. Then, in regard to leases of less than 12 years, obviously I would take a view that in regard to leases, I do not think that 50C will apply, because there is no transfer of land and building or even significant rights thereto or dominion and control thereof. It is only for a limited period, maybe 8, 10 or 12 years, that the property use is permitted to the lessor, lessee. So to that extent, in short-term leases, definitely 50C would not apply. In regard to long-term leases of say 50 or 60 years, there could be some issue. Though the stamp duty, the methodology of determining the value in stamp duty is not a necessary indicator of whether the concept of transfer and land and building and 50C would apply. To my mind, it is a strong indicator, and before you come to a conclusion that in terms of long-term leases, the provision would not apply, one needs to look at it seriously. Because in long-term leases in excess of 30 years, the value of the market value, 90% of the market value is considered for the purpose of stamp duty. So therefore, the thinking seems to be that virtually a significant part of the rights qua the property stand extinguished or stand transferred in the hands of the lessee. So therefore, there could be definitely some case for 50C applying to very long-term leases. In regard to leases in perpetuity, of course, I have no doubt that definitely 50C would apply, because there, again, what remains with the owner is only a semblance of legal title. When you look at the term land and building as a bundle of rights, and if virtually the entire bundle, if the entire contents of the entire bundle are with the transferee, with you having that only that piece of cloth, to my mind, at that stage, 50C might come into play. If, of course, you do continue to enjoy a fair part of that bundle of rights, then one may take a view that to leases, because then you would retain the some part of your control as owner, in which case 50C to leases would not apply. As far as tenancy rights are concerned, to my mind, tenancy rights are only in regard to user of property, and therefore the ownership, the ability to transfer a bundle of rights. There would be two or three things. One is to enjoy the property in its present state, and the ability to transfer or transact in regard to that property without recourse to somebody else. In regard to a tenancy right, tenancy gives only a right of user, the right of the owner to transact in regard to that property, transfer that property without recourse to the tenant remains with the owner, and therefore tenancy right, to my mind, 50C would not apply to a tenancy right. In regard to a flat in a cooperative society, this I deliberately, the example I gave only to bring out the fact that if you try to take a stand that it applies only to land and building, then 90% of the transactions in metros would be out of 50C, because in the cooperative society, neither land is transferred nor building is transferred. The legal title would always rest with the society, and therefore, to my mind, to a flat in a cooperative society also, there would be an applicability of section 50C. With that, let me look at the issues raised in para 1.7. Para 1.7, I have raised this issue that look at the fallout of what interpretation you would put to 50C if one takes a view that it does not apply to development agreements. I have already taken a view that if they do not apply to development agreements, then in the classical scenario of the development agreement giving the dominion control to the developer and mere formality of the conveyance to take place later, in that situation to conveyance also they may not apply, for the simple reason that there is no consideration accruing or arising. But why I brought this out was that if you do draft your transactions, or you do construct your transactions, or you do plan or strategize your transactions in a manner that at the stage of conveyance some consideration does accrue to the owner, then possibly the rigors of 50C may apply at that stage. If at the stage of the executing the final conveyance with the developer, or in the earlier case of a mere agreement of sale holder joining in as confirming party, if certain rights do remain with the owner which are transferred only at the stage of conveyance and some consideration does accrue or arise, then in that stage, at that case, possibly 50C may apply. Of course, what is transferred at that stage is only a small part of the bundle, and therefore for determining the value assessed or assessable for the purpose of stamp duty, according to me, whatever has been transferred earlier would go out, only the balance would remain, so a smaller proportion may still become liable to tax at the stage of conveyance. Such, of course, instances are far and few in between, but if that is really the situation, then even to the conveyance transactions, this would apply. With that, let me look at para 1.8, FSI or TDR. As far as TDR is concerned, to TDR, of course, I am conscious of the recent Bombay High Court judgment that to TDR it will not apply, and there is no reason to take a different view. To TDR, obviously, 50C would not apply, because TDR is a right arising on account of a particular situation in a development control regulation. It's a transferable development right, movable property. Therefore, to TDR, I am of the view that 50C would not apply. But to FSI, which is the development potential of land, I would take a view that development potential of land is a significant part of a bundle of rights qua land, and therefore to FSI, in my opinion, 50C would apply. There, in regard to FSI, there could be two views, but I would personally take a view that to transactions of transfer of development potential in the form of FSI, the provisions of section 50C would apply. As far as the date applicable for stamp duty is concerned, the issue that has been brought out here is that unlike 43CA, which clearly refers to an anterior agreement prior to the agreement that is being registered for the purpose of adopting the stamp duty valuation, such a relief is not available in section 50C. Here I would take two views. One view of the matter is that for the purpose of 50C, registration is not necessary. What you have to look at is the stamp duty value of the transaction, stamp duty value as on the date of transaction, which is assessed or assessable. Now, even if there is a transaction which is, or there is an agreement which is unregistered, even in that situation, if a transfer as is contemplated in 50C, read with 247 is taking place, then to my mind, irrespective of the fact that a formal agreement may be executed subsequently, the earlier value definitely has to be adopted, because it is at that stage when two contracting parties, whether it be a letter of allotment, a booking letter, or an agreement solicitor, parties are ad idem in regard to transfer of land, building, or a part thereof. I think it's possible definitely to take a view that it is that stamp duty valuation that would apply. If of course the transaction is taking place at a later point of time, then of course the later date would apply, and one may not therefore be able to take the benefit of the earlier date. Even then, if a significant part of the consideration has passed prior to, for example, if the transaction is actually entered into, say, in December 2014, but a significant part of the consideration has passed hands, say, in January 2014, then for the purposes of valuation, it should be possible for one to urge that the lower stamp duty valuation should be taken. But of course, in that situation, one will have to really agitate that to a significant extent. Then 1.10 in regard to shares, transfer of immovable property in the form of transfer of shares of a company. This I put forward before you only to as a precursor of where we are going. Because yes, undoubtedly transfer of shares would not be transfer of land and building, because the owner of the land and building would continue to be the company, the legal ownership would still continue to vest with the company. And the transfer of shares ordinarily would be a transfer of movable property. But where the corporate veil can be lifted and the company is only a shell company with the limited purpose of a subsequent transfer of movable property, we already have some judicial pronouncements in that regard. So therefore, I think that the amendment to 247 in regard to transfer of shares of foreign companies, which was specifically to cover a particular eventuality, because the explanation to 247 as is now envisaged, talks of only foreign companies, but days are not far when this will now also apply to shell companies. So if one really seeks to plan in regard to forming a company for that purpose, I think one needs to take care. As far as the slum sale is concerned, I don't think there is any issue there, save and except the fact that as far as a slum sale is concerned, if you are wanting to avoid the rigors of section 50C, then the definition of a slum sale must be satisfied in its entirety, which means that the undertaking has really to be established. You have to transfer an undertaking on which can be understood as an undertaking on a standalone basis for you to get out of 50C. If otherwise that undertaking is nothing but virtually land building, factory building. For example, you have only a building, because I did come across a case where what was being sought to be transferred was only factory building and the only plant and machinery was a weighing scale. Now in that situation, that would never have constituted an undertaking. If it does not constitute an undertaking, then what would flow is that you are transferring nothing but land and building, and to which case 50C may apply. As far as 1.12 is concerned, there is nothing significant. I have pointed out at what stages you would have to raise your queries before an assessing officer. I'll straight go to 1.13, 45.3 versus 50C. There was virtual unanimity among the groups that to a situation of 45.3, 50C would not apply for two reasons. One rule being that the specific provision overrides the general, and the second rule being that there cannot be a fiction on a fiction. Section 45.3 itself is a fiction. I would beg to differ. This is for the reason that Section 45.3 fiction is created with the sole purpose of overcoming the ruling of Sunil Siddharth. In Sunil Siddharth, Supreme Court came to a conclusion that what is credited to the partner's capital account does not amount to consideration. And because it does not amount to consideration, the trigger of capital gains will fail. It is only to overcome that trigger that 45.3 and 45.4 came on the statute. So the full value of the amount credited to in the books of the firm as being treated as full value of consideration, that fiction overcame only the concept of the credit not amounting to consideration. The quantum of full value of consideration, to my mind, was not the object of 45.3. While 50C mandate is to look at the provisions of 50C. Again, if one takes a view that 50C does not operate to 45.3, then in a situation, the easiest proposition is for the property to be introduced into the firm at a value that the parties may choose, and thereafter the retirement of the partners would take place. 45.3 would then obviate the possibility of 50C coming into play. And therefore, I think that 45.3 and section 50C operate in different fields, and it is possible to merge. I am conscious of tribunal rulings. In my initial part of my presentation, I have said that law is an evolving process. We learn every day. Therefore, don't go by what rulings have already come. On an interpretation, I believe that it is possible to urge that even to 45.3 situations, 50C someday may apply. As far as 50 and 50C is concerned, I am conscious of the decision of the special bench. There again, 50 and 50C operate in different fields. So, the special bench already holds that to depreciation of assets, the provisions of 50C would apply. As far as 69BC is concerned, there is nothing to comment on, so I'll straight away then look at 43CA. As far as 43CA is concerned, since we have considered 50C in extenso, I'll briefly deal with the propositions of 43CA. The propositions are contained in para 1.10. The question is, again 43CA talks of transfer of land and building. If the view that I have taken in regard to 50C is correct, to my mind, in regard to properties which are under construction also, the provisions of 43CA would apply and the stamp duty valuation would come into play, that an agreement between the builder and the purchaser of land or building under construction is taking place. Because if that is not the case, then 43CA would virtually never operate. This is because you have at least thousands of buildings in Mumbai where there is no transfer having taken place at all. So therefore, to my mind, in that situation, if 43CA is to operate, then you need to ensure that if there is an agreement which is there between a willing seller and a willing purchaser, then that agreement, whether it be in the form of a letter of allotment, etc., to that the provisions of 43CA would definitely apply. As far as the meaning of the term of agreement is concerned, I would take a view that where parties are added in and the terms of the contract can be garnered from that particular agreement, letter of allotment, at that stage 43CA would definitely apply. There was one issue in regard to application of 43CA as to whether if it would apply, because 43CA one would substitute the stamp duty valuation with the agreement value, whether there is a difference in between that, if that difference should it be brought to tax at the stage of execution of the agreement or at the last stage if a percentage completion is to be followed. According to me, what happens at the stage of 43CA coming into play is merely the substitution of full value of consideration. Once that substitution takes place, based thereon, the profit of the developer will be computed. If he follows, of course, the percentage completion method, that would be brought to tax at when the entire project is complete. If he follows the percentage completion method, the incremental profit, the entire profit, would be prorated over the period of the completion stage. According to me, the percentage completion is a method of accounting that has got nothing to do with determination or taxability of the increment arising on account of the substitution of stamp duty valuation. So either it will go over the period or it will be taxed at the end. There could be two views on that, but this is the view that I would take. As far as consideration other than cash is concerned, as long as you are able to establish that the transaction is a genuine transaction, there would be no problem in adopting the earlier date. The only other purpose of using the term consideration other than cash is only to establish that there is some corroborative evidence to establish that the transaction had taken place at an anterior date, nothing beyond that. Because if it's payment in cash, you don't have that corroborative proof. If there are recording in the books of account which are existing, the transaction is otherwise genuine, then transfers by journal entries also, to my mind, would be permissible. It is possible to take the earlier date at that point of time. As far as 56 is concerned, let me straight away go to the proposition that I have put forth in para 3.3. The distinction that I wanted to bring out here was the distinction between the word transfer as used in 50C and 43CA and the word receive as used in 56. Now, the point is 50C talks of receipt of property or immovable property. If one again takes a view that immovable property being land and building does not include any right thereto, and it is land and building simpliciter, then of course to such a transaction where a building is under construction, 56 would come into play only at the point of time that the construction is complete, which of course could be disadvantages, but here we are not considering advantages and disadvantages, interpreting the law as it is. So I would take a view that even though you are doing interpreting the word receive, the other side of the coin is, if there is a receiver, there is a giver. If there is a giver, and in from the hands of the giver that particular property is transported, then to my mind it does not stand in vacuum. It is then received by the receiver at that point of time alone. So to my mind, in the illustration that I have given in para 3.3, the earlier date, that is April 2013 would apply, and the assessment year would be 2014-15. Coming to the other deeming fictions which I have dealt with in the latter part of my paper, 4.1, agricultural. Here the issue was, what is the true ambit of the explanation, and there have been used to express that even the seedlings and sapling in a nursery grown on the terrace of a flat would also be eligible. The explanation was brought in only to plug the loophole that in a nursery what was happening was that after a particular process having taken place which had connection with the land, because for agricultural income you need to have connection with the land. After that process was gone through, the seedlings and saplings were then transported to a nursery and grown in a nursery which necessarily was, seedlings and saplings were grown on benches or corrugated sheets in a nursery which was a part of the farm, and the view sought to be taken at that point of time is to that latter part of the secondary operation would not be treated as agricultural operation. To overcome that situation, you had the explanation coming in. For the purposes of agricultural income in terms of section 2, and definite connection with land is required, and therefore the word nursery as used in the explanation has got, to my mind, a limited connotation. It would not go all over, and according to me, yes, to nurseries which are purely run as nurseries in the classical sense, even if they are in urban areas, you may be able to get the benefit of agricultural income, but not across the board. As far as mushroom farming is concerned, I would take a view that yes, this does not amount to agriculture. Mushroom farming, you already have a decision of the Bangalore Tribunal in Blue Mountain Foods 14 ITD, if I mistake not, as well as the proposition that earlier, prior to its deletion in regard to mushroom farming, there was a specific deduction available under 80JJA, which later went out of the statute. But based on these two reasonings, I would feel that for mushroom farming, you would not have the benefit of it being treated as agricultural income. As far as 4.2 is concerned, the explanation to section 37.1. The explanation to section 37.1, again, it's a fiction of law. And if it's a fiction, one has to look at the purpose for which it was created. It was brought on the statute book to ensure that bribes, extortion money, or patently illegal payments were not claimed as business expenditure. Now, if you look at the manner in which that expenditure is, the explanation is worded, it talks of expenditure incurred, the purpose of the expenditure being the offence, or such expenditure being prohibited by law, shall not be deemed to have been incurred. So therefore, you must have a purpose which is contemporaneous with or anterior to the incurrence of the expenditure, because the law uses the word purpose of which is an offence. Obviously, a penalty, and I am not saying that all penalties are necessarily reductions, but a penalty is an event subsequent to an infraction of law or regulation. So therefore, if penalty constitutes an expenditure, the purpose of penalty would never be an offense, because penalty is subsequent to an infraction of law. Now, whether a penalty is incurred exclusively or wholly or exclusively for the purposes of business, which is the mandate of section 37(1), one will have to test independently. But to my mind, the explanation simpliciter would never apply to penalties, for the simple reason that penalties are an event which takes place subsequent to an offence having been committed. So therefore, neither are penalties prohibited by law, because they are the result of an infraction of law. So to my mind, the explanation will not apply. Certain small penalties which are on account of technical infractions of law, I think would still be allowed. I am conscious of a recent judgment of the Supreme Court saying that SEBI regulations, penalties in regard to SEBI regulations would not be allowed, not under the Income Tax Act. But I believe that we have to test it on the parameters of whether such penalties are so small or of such a nature which a businessman would have to incur in the normal conduct of his business. In that situation, to my mind, to those penalties, deduction under section 37(1) would be available. To other penalties, of course, they would not be available. As far as penal interest is concerned, the classical decision in Prakash Cotton Mill's standard batteries would apply, and to the extent that you are able to bifurcate between a compensatory payment and a penal interest, the compensatory would be allowed, the penal would not be allowed. 4.3, fictions which expand the ambit. There, as far as 2009 date is concerned, I merely brought it out to point out that earlier you did not have the definition of a relative in section 56 qua the HUF. Now you have that specific definition coming in, and therefore post 1st October 2009, the exclusion from a gift or exclusion from the charge to section 56 would operate only in a situation where the person is a member and not otherwise. What really would benefit, I would not know, because if a member impresses his self-acquired property with HUF character, you have 64(2) coming out into play, which I have dealt with subsequently. So, to my mind, that there has to be a relook at that particular definition. But otherwise, as of now, at least to HUF, gift other than member would become chargeable under section 56. As far as the second example is concerned, rare recording, if you look at property has been defined in a specific manner in section 56. Virtually all other properties are tangible properties. Whether that recording could be tangible property or not is something which one needs to consider, and whether it would be a work of art as is falling within that particular clause. Whether a recording itself is a work of art, I do not know. I would rather go with the view that a performance, a musical performance or a performance by a vocalist ends at a point of time that the performance ends, the art ends there. Subsequent there, because in all other art forms, pictures, sculptures or anything else, the artist performs and there is the end result which is in tangible form. In case of a performance, like a theatre performance, musical performance, the work of art according to the ends at that point of time. So it needs to be urged whether this recording would constitute work of art. As far as gold coins with goddess Lakshmi is concerned, many of the groups have taken a view that the coin amounts to bullion. Now question is that gold coin with Lakshmi mark on it, is it to be classified as bullion or can it be classified as something else? If of course you receive 100 gold coins, though I don't know whether one would receive the same, they are welcome, but
they possibly, if you receive 100, yes, one may be able to take a view that it is brilliant, but if one receives a single coin, which as a devotee I keep in my house and perform puja, then the old decisions which applied to what constituted a personal effect and what did not may still hold a field in the context of section 56, and I think one needs to consider that a little more deeply. As far as the issue of stock in trade is concerned, stock in trade and flat is concerned, the question that, the issue that I wanted to really point out was that in section 56 the explanation uses the word property, capital asset, being so and so. So it's a specific definition which uses the word capital asset. So therefore, here both persons, the giver and receiver, are developers. So question is, in the hands of the giver, it was stock in trade. What would really happen under section 56? I would take a view that yes, 56 would still apply, because when you give that particular flat, you are withdrawing that from your